Have you ever looked at an old map and wondered why empires rose where they did? Why some civilizations thrived for centuries while others vanished almost as quickly as they appeared? The answer isn't just in the battles fought or the leaders who ruled. It's etched into the very land itself. Rivers, mountains, and deserts weren't just backdrops to history. They were the invisible hands shaping the destiny of nations. Picture this: the Nile, a lifeline cutting through the desert, turning barren land into the breadbasket of ancient Egypt. Or the Himalayas, standing like a colossal wall, shielding India from invasions while isolating its cultures for generations. These natural features weren't just scenery, they were the secret weapons of empires. Think about the Roman Empire, its vast territories strung together like pearls along the Mediterranean coast. That sea wasn't just water, it was a highway, a marketplace, and a moat all at once, connecting cities and fueling trade while keeping enemies at bay. Or consider the Great Wall of China, snaking across mountains and valleys, not just as a barrier but as a symbol of how geography could be bent to human will. These borders weren't drawn at random, they were forged by the land itself, dictating where armies could march, where crops could grow, and where cultures would collide. The Earth's contours held the blueprints for power, and those who understood them ruled the world. But here's the twist: geography didn't just build empires, it also doomed them. The same rivers that nourished cities could flood them into oblivion. The same mountains that protected kingdoms could trap them in isolation. And when climates shifted or trade routes dried up, even the mightiest civilizations crumbled. Today, we'll unravel these hidden stories, tracing how the lay of the land shaped the fate of millions. You'll never look at a map the same way again, because behind every border, there's a secret waiting to be uncovered. A story of ambition, survival, and the relentless power of the natural world. So let's begin this journey, not just through history, but through the landscapes that silently ruled it. Take the Nile, winding through the desert like a ribbon of life. Every summer, its floods left behind rich black silt, turning dry earth into fields of wheat and barley. Without that endless cycle of renewal, the pyramids might never have risen, and pharaohs would have ruled over sand instead of a thriving civilization. But the Nile did more than feed Egypt, it unified it. Boats carrying grain, stone, and soldiers moved up and down its length, binding distant cities into one kingdom. Even their gods reflected the river's power, with Hapi, the deity of the Nile's floods, worshipped as the source of all abundance. Now, shift your gaze to Mesopotamia, where the Tigris and Euphrates cradled the world's first cities. Unlike the predictable Nile, these rivers were wild, flooding without warning. But that unpredictability forced innovation. Canals zigzagged across the land, and scribes recorded water levels on clay tablets, creating some of history's earliest bureaucracies. Here, geography didn't just provide resources, it demanded ingenuity. The ziggurats towering over weren't just temples, they were responses to the flat landscape, artificial mountains reaching for the gods. Then there's the Indus Valley, where engineers designed intricate drainage systems to manage monsoon rains. Streets laid out in perfect grids with covered sewers beneath them reveal a society that didn't just adapt to its environment, it mastered it. But rivers could also be barriers. The Danube carved a path through Europe, marking the edge of Rome's empire, while the Yellow River's shifting course alternately nurtured and devastated Chinese dynasties. Yet for all their gifts, rivers had a dark side. Droughts could starve empires and floods could erase them in days. When the Euphrates changed course, entire cities were abandoned, their ruins buried under silt. The very waters that gave life could also take it away, a reminder that geography was never just a backdrop. It was a force as unpredictable as human ambition. And speaking of forces, let's turn to the mountains where the earth itself became a fortress. Mountains rise like nature's own fortresses, their jagged peaks carving boundaries no army could easily cross. Take the Himalayas, towering so high they shielded India for centuries, turning back invasions from Alexander the Great to the Mongol hordes. These weren't just rocks, they were silent guardians, forcing would-be conquerors to either turn back or waste years navigating treacherous passes. And then there were the Alps, standing between Rome and the northern tribes, their snowy slopes acting as a natural moat that kept barbarians at bay until the empire grew too weak to hold its own gates. But mountains didn't just defend, they demanded adaptation. Persia's kings, faced with the Zagros ranges, didn't just surrender to the terrain. They carved roads like the royal highway, turning obstacles into arteries of trade and control. Meanwhile, in the Andes, the Inca transformed steep slopes into cascading terraces, engineering farmland where none should exist. Their empire didn't fight the mountains, it danced with them, turning vertical cliffs into a ladder of abundance. Isolation bred ingenuity, giving rise to cultures as unique as the landscapes that cradled them. Yet for every empire that thrived in the heights, others found only barriers. The same peaks that protected also trapped, cutting off societies from new ideas or alliances. The Mongols, though, saw opportunity where others saw walls. They mastered the art of moving armies through mountain passes, using the terrain to ambush enemies and vanish like ghosts. For them, the land wasn't a hurdle, it was a weapon. Now, imagine standing at the edge of a desert where the next challenge wasn't elevation but emptiness. Deserts could be death sentences or golden opportunities. It all depended on who dared to cross them. The Sahara, stretching endlessly under a scorching sun, wasn't just an obstacle, it was a sprawling marketplace. Caravans of camels, sometimes thousands strong, trudged across dunes carrying salt from the north to trade for gold in the south. Cities like Timbuktu rose where the sand met the savannah, their wealth built on the backs of merchants who turned emptiness into a highway. And then there was the go-by, so vast it bent the Silk Road itself. Traders didn't cut through it, they skirted its edges, turning dusty oases into thriving pit stops where silk, spices, and ideas changed hands. But deserts had a cruel side too. Persia learned this the hard way when 50,000 soldiers marched into Egypt's sands, only to vanish without a trace. The same dunes that hid trade routes could swallow armies whole, leaving nothing but bones and legends. Even the Romans, masters of strategy, knew better than to fight the desert head-on. Instead, they choked off its lifelines, controlling the few wells and ports along the Arabian desert's edge to dominate the spice trade. Scarcity was their weapon. After all, in a land where water was rarer than gold, whoever held the oasis held the power. Now, let's turn to the coastlines where water wasn't a barrier but a battleground. The sea could feed empires or drown them, and the nations that understood its rhythms ruled the world. Coastlines weren't just edges of empires, they were their beating hearts. Picture the Mediterranean not as a barrier but as Rome's sprawling highway, where grain ships from Egypt and marble from Greece flowed into the capital like clockwork. Every wave carried wealth, and every port was a thread in a vast web of control. Carthage, perched on the African coast, grew fat on trade until Rome burned it to the ground, proving that coastal wealth could be as much a target as a treasure. Now sail east to the Indian Ocean, where monsoons acted like nature's traffic signals. Merchants timed voyages to the winds, riding them from East Africa's golden beaches to the spice docks of India and beyond. The Swahili city of Kilwa thrived on this watery exchange, its coral palaces built on seashell money, while Chinese treasure fleets, hundreds of ships strong, turned the ocean into a floating empire. But these waters weren't always kind. A single storm could sink fortunes, and pirates lurked like wolves, waiting to pick off stragglers. The sea gave, but it also took away. Then there were the masters of the waves, the Phoenicians, who didn't just sail but invented the rules of the game. Their ships, built from Lebanon's towering cedars, became floating warehouses, carrying purple dye, glass, and alphabet letters from port to port. They didn't conquer land, they conquered trade routes, turning the Mediterranean into their marketplace. Centuries later, Britain would play a similar hand. As an island, it had no choice but to look outward, and its wooden walls, those legendary ships, became the foundation of an empire where the sun never set. But for every Venice whose canals channeled the wealth of continents, there was a lost Atlantis, a reminder that the sea's favor was fickle. When the Hanseatic League's Baltic trade dried up, so did its power, and when the Minoans' ships faltered, their palaces fell to ash. The lesson was clear: control the waves and you could feed an empire, lose them and you'd drown in your own ambition. Now, let's step inland where another force shaped destinies, the endless green sea of forests. Forests could be silent killers or unexpected allies. It all depended on who dared to enter them. Take the Teutoburg forest, where towering oaks and tangled underbrush became Rome's graveyard. 3 legions, among the empire's finest, marched in formation only to be picked off one by Germanic tribes who knew every route and ravine. The trees themselves seemed to conspire against the invaders, narrowing paths into death traps. Rome never forgot that lesson. For all their roads and discipline, they learned the hard way. No empire, no matter how mighty, could conquer geography. But forests didn't just defend, they demanded reinvention. The Mongols, masters of the open steppe, found themselves floundering in Europe's dense woodlands. Their horses, built for speed on plains, stumbled in the undergrowth, so they adapted, recruiting local guides and switching to lighter armor, proving that even the world's greatest conquerors had to bow to the land's will. Meanwhile, Venice turned forests into empires. Their shipyards devoured Balkan timber, crafting galleys that dominated the Mediterranean. Without those towering pines and oaks, the Venetian navy would have been toothless, a reminder that trees could build kingdoms as surely as they could destroy armies. Then there were the forests that sheltered rather than challenged. The Amazon's endless green maze wasn't just a barrier, it was a sanctuary. Tribes like the Kayapo mapped its rivers and clearings with precision, turning what outsiders saw as wilderness into a living pantry and pharmacy. While empires rose and fell beyond the canopy, these cultures thrived, their knowledge of the forest weaving a shield no sword could pierce. Even today, vast stretches remain unexplored, hiding secrets older than pyramids. Yet forests had their own brutal logic. In medieval Japan, warlords used dense bamboo groves to ambush rivals, while the Black Forest became a stage for Europe's bloodiest feuds. Wood wasn't just a resource, it was a weapon. Armies burned whole stands to flush out enemies, and castles rose where timber was plentiful, their walls literally rooted in the land's bounty. The lesson was clear: forests didn't take sides. They rewarded those who listened and destroyed those who didn't. Now, lift your gaze from the tangled undergrowth to the open skies, where plateaus and valleys cradled civilizations like gifts from the earth itself. Plateaus and valleys weren't just scenery, they were stages where history's greatest dramas unfolded. High in the Himalayas, the Tibetan plateau's thin air and rugged terrain made it a fortress of both body and spirit. Monasteries clung to cliffs like eagles' nests, their prayer flags fluttering in winds so fierce they could strip the breath from invaders. When armies like the Mongols or the Chinese tried to conquer Tibet, they found more than just resistance. They faced the land itself. Horses gasped for oxygen, and soldiers stumbled dizzy through passes where every step felt like lifting a boulder. Yet for those born to the heights, like the Sherpas, this was home. Their bodies adapted over generations, turning what outsiders saw as a wasteland into a sanctuary. The plateau didn't just protect Tibet, it shaped its identity, making it a realm where spirituality soared as high as the mountains. Now descend to the valleys where the earth cradled civilizations like a mother holding a child. The Fertile Crescent, a stretch of land between the Tigris and Euphrates, wasn't just fertile, it was revolutionary. Here, wild grasses became wheat, and scattered villages grew into the world's first cities. The valley's gentle slopes and predictable floods made farming not just possible but prosperous. But it wasn't just about food. The flat land allowed ideas to spread as quickly as crops, with scribes in Sumer inventing writing to track harvests, and priests in Babylon charting the stars. Valleys were more than geography, they were incubators of human genius. Half a world away, the Mexican plateau told a different story. At its heart stood Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, built on an island in a lake. The high elevation kept the air cool, while the surrounding valleys funneled water and trade into the city. When Spanish conquistadors first saw it, they gasped at its canals and temples, comparing it to Venice. But the plateau's gifts came with a price. Thin air slowed their advance, and the lack of flat land forced the Aztecs to invent floating gardens just to feed their people. Yet they thrived, turning challenges into triumphs. Then there's Kathmandu, nestled in a valley so lush it became a crossroads of cultures. Traders from India, monks from Tibet, and artists from Persia all passed through, leaving behind temples and traditions that blended into something entirely new. The valley's walls sheltered it from monsoons and marauders alike, creating a pocket of peace where art and religion flourished. But isolation could be a double-edged sword. When earthquakes struck, the same mountains that protected trapped residents in a bowl of rubble. Yet for all their blessings, plateaus and valleys had their own rules. The Andes' high-altitude plateaus forced the Inca to engineer terraces that clung to cliffs, while Ethiopia's rugged highlands repelled invaders for centuries. Thin air starved armies of oxygen, and steep valleys funneled enemies into deadly ambushes. Geography wasn't just a setting, it was a player in the game, deciding who rose and who fell. And if plateaus and valleys were the chessboard, then the passes between them were the moves that decided the match. Strategic passes weren't just gaps in the mountains, they were the turnstiles of history, where empires rose or fell on the strength of a single narrow path. Take the Khyber Pass, a winding scar through the Hindu Kush that linked the riches of India to the steppes of Central Asia. For centuries, conquerors from Alexander the Great to Genghis Khan funneled their armies through this rocky throat, each step dictated by the land itself. The British learned its power the hard way during the Afghan wars, when tribes who knew every crevice turned the pass into a slaughterhouse. Even today, control over this corridor sparks tensions between nations, proving that geography doesn't just shape history, it repeats it. Then there's Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held off a Persian tied not just with spears, but with the land as their ally. The pass was so narrow that Xerxes' army, vast as an ocean, could only advance a few men at a time. The rocks and cliffs became Leonidas's silent partners, turning brute force into a futile exercise. Centuries later, the same logic played out at the Brenner Pass, the Alpine gateway between Italy and Germany. Roman legions, Napoleon's troops, and World War II tanks all clashed here because whoever held this corridor held the keys to Europe. These weren't just battles over territory, they were battles against the earth itself, where the ground dictated the terms of engagement. Yet passes weren't just barriers, they were also lifelines. The Silk Road's wealth flowed through the Pamir Mountains' high passes, where caravans braved thin air and bandits to trade silk for silver. And in the Andes, the Inca built suspension bridges across dizzying gorges, turning deadly drops into strands of their imperial web. The lesson was clear: if you couldn't move the mountain, you had to outthink it. Now shift your gaze from the mountains to the waves, where islands wrote their own rules of empire. Islands didn't just sit in the water, they bent the world around them. Think of Crete, floating between Europe, Africa, and Asia like a stepping stone. The Minoans didn't conquer their neighbors with armies, they seduced them with trade, their ships weaving a web of influence that turned their island into the Mediterranean's first thalassocracy. Meanwhile, Britain's isolation behind the English Channel let it play Europe like a chessboard, swooping in to tip the balance of power without ever risking invasion. An island wasn't just land, it was a strategy, a natural fortress with built-in moats. But isolation could also spark innovation. On Easter Island, with no neighbors to borrow from, the Rapa Nui carved towering moai from volcanic rock, their culture evolving in a bubble until the very trees they depended on vanished. Japan's archipelago fostered a society so distinct that when Commodore Perry's black ships arrived, the shockwaves reshaped a nation overnight. Islands didn't just protect, they preserved, incubating ideas and traditions that mainland empires might have crushed. Yet for every Briton that ruled the waves, there was a Malta, a speck of rock so strategic that everyone from the Phoenicians to the Nazis fought over it. Or consider Singapore, a swampy island turned into a global port because someone realized its narrow strait controlled the flow of Asian trade. Islands proved that size didn't matter, location did. A dot on the map could command oceans, provided it stood in the right current. Now, imagine an empire without borders, where power flowed like water through the cracks of geography. Climate zones didn't just dictate the weather, they wrote the rules of survival. Picture the Fertile Crescent, where mild winters and predictable rains coaxed wild grains into abundance, giving birth to agriculture itself. Now contrast that with the Sahara, where scorching days and freezing nights forced the Tuareg to become nomads, their survival hinging on knowing which dunes hid water and which hid death. The Earth's climate wasn't just a backdrop, it was a silent dictator deciding who farmed, who fought, and who faded into dust. Take the Indus Valley, where monsoon rains arrived like clockwork, filling rivers and fields until the cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro buzzed with life. But when those rains faltered, the entire civilization crumbled like dried mud. Meanwhile, in Mesoamerica, the Maya turned erratic rainfall into an advantage, building reservoirs so vast they could outlast droughts. Their pyramids weren't just temples, they were rain gauges, their steps aligned to track the seasons with celestial precision. Climate didn't just challenge these cultures, it shaped their very souls, embedding resilience into their myths and rituals. Then there were the Arctic's masters, the Inuit, who transformed a frozen wasteland into a pantry. Where others saw only ice, they saw seals breathing under frozen cracks and caribou trails invisible to outsiders. Their igloos weren't just shelters, they were engineering marvels, trapping body heat so efficiently that temperatures inside could soar while blizzards raged outside. Compare that to the Polynesians, who read ocean currents like road maps, their double-hulled canoes riding trade winds to islands scattered like crumbs across the Pacific. For them, climate wasn't a barrier, it was a language, and fluency meant survival. But when climates shifted, so did destinies. The Akkadian Empire, once the Middle East's powerhouse, collapsed when drought strangled its fields, turning clay tablets into desperate prayers for rain. Greenland's Vikings clung to European farming methods as temperatures dropped, their cows starving while the Inuit thrived next door. The lesson was brutal: adapt or perish. Even the mighty Khmer Empire, with its sprawling temple complex at Angkor Wat, watched its reservoirs evaporate when monsoons failed, its stone faces crumbling under the weight of a changing sky. Yet some turned climate into conquest. The Mongols, born on the frigid steppes, used winter as a weapon, launching attacks when rivers froze solid, creating highways where enemies least expected them. And in the Andes, the Incas' vertical empire stacked crops like a ladder: corn in the warm valleys, potatoes on cool slopes, quinoa near the clouds, exploiting every microclimate like a gambler playing a stacked deck. Their secret: diversity. When one crop failed, another thrived, making famine as rare as a snowless peak. Now, imagine standing at the edge of a rainforest where humidity hangs thick enough to drink. Here, the Maya didn't just survive, they flourished, turning thin tropical soil into endless fields with a technique so simple it was genius. Charcoal mixed with broken pottery, creating terra preta, earth so rich it still baffles scientists today. Meanwhile, in Southeast Asia, the Khmer carved canals so precise they mimicked the monsoon's ebb and flow, their empire rising and falling with the water's rhythm. Rainforests weren't just jungles, they were open-air laboratories where the right knowledge could turn green chaos into gold, but climates could also be cages. The Australian outback's punishing heat locked Aboriginal tribes into a dance with drought, their songlines mapping waterholes across thousands of miles. And in the American Southwest, the ancestral Pueblones built cliff dwellings not for grandeur but necessity. Their adobe walls kept them cool in blistering summers and warm when desert nights turned to ice. These weren't just homes, they were climate-controlled fortresses, proof that even the harshest zones could be mastered with enough ingenuity. Yet the cruelest twist: climates changed and empires rarely saw it coming. The Anasazi vanished when rain stopped, leaving behind empty granaries and haunting petroglyphs of parched earth. The Tiwanaku of Lake Titicaca watched their raised fields, once the envy of the Andes, turn to mud when glaciers retreated. Their ruins whisper the same warning: no empire, no matter how brilliant, outlasts the sky. Now turn your gaze from the clouds to the soil beneath your feet, where the earth's riches hid in plain sight. The Roman warm period didn't just bring sunshine, it built an empire. For centuries, steady rains and mild temperatures turned the Mediterranean basin into a breadbasket, filling Roman granaries until they overflowed. Vineyards stretched farther north than ever before, and olive groves thrived in lands once too cold for cultivation. This wasn't just good weather, it was economic fuel. With full stomachs and bustling trade routes, Rome could feed its legions, build its monuments, and expand its borders. But when the climate shifted, so did fortunes. The same fields that once fed millions began to fail, and the empire's brittle reliance on predictable harvests cracked under the strain. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, the Vikings faced the opposite problem. Their settlements in Greenland, founded during the medieval warm period, were miracles of adaptation, farms perched on the edge of the Arctic, where grassy fjords briefly allowed cattle to graze. But when the Little Ice Age descended like a frosty curtain, those same fjords froze solid. The Vikings, stubbornly clinging to European farming traditions, watched their livestock starve while the Inuit, masters of ice and snow, thrived beside them. The lesson was brutal. Climate didn't care about tradition. It rewarded those who listened and erased those who didn't. Now sail to the Indian Ocean, where monsoons didn't just bring rain, they dictated empires. Every year, sailors timed their voyages to these winds, riding them like clockwork between Africa, Arabia, and India. The Swahili city-states grew fat on this rhythm, their coral palaces built with wealth spun from monsoon-time trade. But when those winds faltered, so did kingdoms. The Khmer Empire's mighty reservoirs, designed to capture monsoon rains, turned to mud pits when the skies grew stingy. Their temples, built to touch the heavens, became monuments to a bargain with the clouds that had expired. Then there were the Mongols, whose entire existence was a negotiation with the steppes' harsh logic. When droughts shriveled grasslands, they didn't pray for rain. They rode toward it, conquering greener pastures with ruthless efficiency. Their empire wasn't born from greed but necessity, a survival strategy written in hoofbeats across continents. Even their greatest weapon, the horse, was a product of their environment, bred to endure the very conditions that would break lesser beasts. But adaptation wasn't just about survival, it could be pure ingenuity. The Maya, staring down relentless droughts, didn't just grow crops, they reinvented them. Drought-resistant strains of maize, planted in layered fields that trapped moisture, turned barren soil into gardens. Their pyramids weren't just temples, they were rainmakers designed to funnel every precious drop into reservoirs. While neighboring civilizations collapsed under the weight of shifting skies, the Maya's flexibility bought them extra centuries of glory. Now shift your gaze from the skies to the earth itself, because beneath every empire's feet lay treasures far more valuable than gold, the raw materials that fueled their rise. Spain's galleons groaned under the weight of stolen gold, yet their empire crumbled while Britain, fueled by soot and steam, reshaped the world. Why? Because resources aren't just wealth, they're leverage. The conquistadors hauled mountains of silver from Potosi, but inflation hollowed their economy like termites in a gilded palace. Meanwhile, British coal pits became engines of empire, turning fire into factories and factories into global dominance. The lesson: it's not what you take from the earth, it's what you do with it. Take Anatolia's iron, so pure it forged the swords of empires. The Hittites guarded its secrets like dragons hoarding treasure, until their smiths taught the world to temper metal. Suddenly, chariots rolled faster, armor grew lighter, and battles tipped in favor of those who controlled the mines. Even the Romans, masters of conquest, bent the knee to geography when they seized Spain's mercury deposits without them. Their silver mines stalled, and without silver, their legions starved. Resources didn't just fund wars, they dictated who could fight them. Then there's the Silk Road, where caravans carried more than silk and spices. Paper from China revolutionized record-keeping, while Roman glass dazzled courts from Persia to Kyoto. But the real treasure was knowledge. Gunpowder recipes whispered between traders, astrolabes passed like secrets, and disease vectors hiding in cargo holds. The Mongols understood this better than anyone. They didn't just conquer territory, they commandeered the flow of goods and ideas, turning the steppe into history's greatest information superhighway. Yet for every empire that thrived on abundance, others withered from scarcity. Venice's ascent began with salt, a humble mineral that preserved food and power. Their monopoly on Adriatic salt routes bankrolled the Doge's palaces and the ships that guarded them. But when Portugal's sailors bypassed the Mediterranean, finding sea routes to Spice Islands, Venice's golden age evaporated like mist off the canals. The Dutch, though, turned scarcity into strategy. With no natural resources, they invented stock exchanges and insurance, transforming Amsterdam into a warehouse where the world's goods changed hands. Now consider the humble potato. Dug from Andean soil, it crossed the Atlantic to become Europe's salvation. When wheat failed, potatoes thrived, fueling population booms that filled factories and armies. Ireland learned the dark side of this dependence when blight turned fields to rot, proving that even the mightiest empires danced to the tune of harvests. Borders then were never just lines, they were sieves straining wealth and weakness. the Ottoman Empire straddled trade routes like a toll collector, growing fat on taxes from every bale of Persian silk or Indian pepper that crossed its grasp. But when Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa, bypassing their chokehold, the Ottomans' golden goose flew away. Geography giveth and geography taketh away. So next time you see an old map, don't just look at the borders, look at what flowed beneath them. The iron that armed legions, the coal that powered looms, the spices that tempted explorers. These invisible currents didn't just shape empires, they built the modern world. And the nations that mastered them didn't just draw borders, they wrote history. The Great Wall of China didn't just keep invaders out, it shaped who came in. Watchtowers doubled as customs checkpoints where silk and spices entered, while ideas filtered through like water through stone. Beyond its bricks lay the steppe, a sea of grass that bred horsemen who'd rattled dynasties for centuries. But the wall wasn't just defense, it was a cultural sieve. Tribes who traded peacefully were funneled through guarded gates, absorbing Chinese language and customs, while raiders found themselves staring at 30 feet of stone and a hail of arrows. The wall didn't just divide, it curated, deciding which outsiders became neighbors and which remained legends. Now, cross continents to Rome's Limes Germanicus, a border so precise it might as well have been drawn with a ruler. On one side, paved roads, aqueducts, and the rule of law. On the other, dense forests where tribes whispered of gods who demanded blood sacrifice. The Romans didn't just fear the wilderness, they mythologized it, turning the Rhine into a psychological barrier as much as a physical one. Yet even here, borders bled. Germanic mercenaries enlisted in Roman legions, bringing home coins and Latin phrases, while Roman traders slipped beyond the palisades to barter for amber and furs. The edge of empire wasn't a line, it was a membrane permeable to everything but conquest. Then there were borders that refused to be pinned down. The Sahara's southern fringe shifted with the dunes, where camel caravans followed oases like stepping stones across a golden ocean. Here, kingdoms like Ghana and Mali rose not behind walls but atop trade routes, their wealth measured in salt and gold dust. Their borders were negotiations, flexing with the seasons and the strength of their rulers. Contrast that with the Pyrenees, where mountains stood like stubborn referees between France and Spain. No army could argue with those peaks. They enforced separation with avalanches and sheer cliffs, creating cultures as distinct as Catalan and Basque, pressed together yet never blending. But borders didn't just mark territory, they dictated how empires governed. Persia's royal roads spider-webbed from Susa to Sardis, turning harsh landscapes into highways for tax collectors and decrees. Every mile marker was a reminder the king's reach ended here. China's mandarins took it further, grading provinces by how easily rice could be shipped to the capital. Fertile valleys paid taxes in grain, while mountainous regions offered silver or soldiers instead. Geography didn't just draw borders, it wrote the rulebooks for ruling them. Even the sea had its own laws. Venice's maritime empire stretched across the Adriatic, its borders floating with its galleys. Instead of walls, they built lighthouses and harbor chains, controlling not land but lanes of saltwater traffic. Lose a naval battle and your border shrank overnight. Meanwhile, the Incas' rope bridges and mountain storehouses let them govern vertically, taxing villages in potatoes or wool depending on the altitude. Their empire wasn't flat on a map, it was stacked like layers of a cake, each tier with its own climate and crops. The cruelest irony, borders often outlasted the empires that drew them. The Durand Line, scratched onto maps by British colonists, still sparks disputes between Afghanistan and Pakistan. The Sykes-Picot Agreement's invisible lines fractured the Middle East into uneasy states. Geography might have set the stage, but human ambition wrote the script, and the earth always had the final edit. Mountains don't just divide landscapes, they shape political destinies. Take Switzerland, where jagged peaks and deep valleys carve the country into isolated cantons, each governing itself like a miniature republic. Without wide plains to unite under a single ruler, the Swiss turned fragmentation into strength, developing a decentralized system where local voices mattered as much as distant kings. Contrast that with Egypt, where the Nile's predictable floods created a different kind of power. Every drop of water, every grain of silt, flowed past the pharaoh's capital, making centralized control not just possible but inevitable. The river wasn't just a source of life, it was a geographic leash tethering the entire kingdom to whoever held its banks. Now sail across the map to England, an island so surrounded by water that its rulers had no choice but to master the waves. With no land borders to defend, England poured its resources into ships, turning the English Channel into both shield and sword. The Navy didn't just protect trade routes, it became the empire's spine, stretching from the Caribbean to Hong Kong. Yet islands could also be traps. Japan's isolation during the Edo period preserved its culture, but left it scrambling when foreign gunboats shattered centuries of seclusion. Water could nurture or strangle, depending on who controlled the horizon. Then there were the steppes, where empires rose and fell on horseback. The Mongols didn't build palaces or tax bureaus, they built mobility. Their capital wasn't a city but a moving court of felt tents, following the grazing lands that fed their armies. When Genghis Khan summoned his generals, they didn't travel to him. He let the seasons dictate where they'd gather, turning geography into a logistical advantage. Governing from the saddle meant decisions were made on the move, with messengers galloping across thousands of miles to deliver orders written on birch bark. The land didn't just permit this system, it demanded it. But the true lifelines of empires weren't just rivers or roads, they were the fragile threads of trade. The Silk Road wasn't a single path but a web of trails, where a merchant in Samarkand could trade Chinese porcelain for Venetian glass without ever seeing either ocean. Cities like Kashgar and Bukhara thrived not because of their armies but their caravanserais, where goods and gossip flowed as freely as water. Lose control of these routes, and even the mightiest empires gasped for air. When the Ottomans choked off Europe's spice supply, they didn't just spark the age of exploration, they signed their own slow decline. Then there were the invisible highways of the sea. Venice's wealth came not from land but from tariffs, its docks buzzing with ships carrying Egyptian cotton, Syrian dyes, and Crimean grain. The Dutch East India Company didn't conquer territory, it conquered supply chains, turning tiny Amsterdam into the world's warehouse. And when Britain's navy clamped down on Napoleon's ports, it wasn't just blockading ships, it was suffocating an economy. Trade routes were empires' circulatory systems, and whoever controlled the pulse controlled the body. Yet these networks had their own vulnerabilities. A single storm could sink a year's worth of silk shipments, and a desert tribe charging protection fees could strangle a caravan route overnight. The Hanseatic League, a medieval powerhouse of Baltic trade, crumbled when new sea routes made its ports obsolete. Geography didn't just enable empires, it kept them on a leash, reminding them that no throne was built to last. Now follow the scent of spice to where geography's grip loosened just enough for fortune to slip through. Geography didn't just dictate where trade routes would go, it forced empires to innovate or perish. Think of the Silk Road's winding paths, where every mountain pass and desert crossing demanded solutions. Chinese engineers perfected the compass not out of curiosity, but necessity. Without it, caravans vanished into the go-by's shifting sands, their cargoes of silk and porcelain lost to the dunes. Meanwhile, the Persians dug qanats, underground canals that siphoned water from mountains to arid plains, turning death valleys into pit stops bustling with merchants. Even something as simple as the camel's saddle transformed trade. The Arabs redesigned it to carry heavier loads, turning the ships of the desert into freight trains that could cross the Sahara in 40 days. Every innovation was a rebellion against the land's limits. Now consider the sea. The Indian Ocean's monsoons didn't just blow ships off course, they inspired an entire calendar of sailing. Arab navigators mapped wind patterns so precisely they could predict arrival dates within days. Their dhows crisscrossing thousands of miles without a single compass. And then there were the Vikings, whose longboats rode shallow rivers deep into Europe, their hulls so light they could be dragged overland between waterways. These weren't just boats, they were geographic loopholes, bending the rules of where armies could go. But perhaps the most surprising inventions came from scarcity. Venice, with no farmland, didn't just trade, it industrialized. Glassmakers on Murano Island guarded furnace secrets like state secrets, turning silica and ash into lenses that would later power telescopes. No forests, no problem. The Dutch built windmills to drain swamps, creating farmland from seabed. Even the Incas' lack of wheels led to brilliance. Their knotted quipu records could track taxes across peaks where carts would tumble into ravines. The lesson was clear. Geography didn't just challenge empires, it sharpened them. When the Ottomans clogged overland spice routes, Portugal's caravels sailed around Africa, their hulls stuffed with astrolabes stolen from Arab maps. What looked like defiance was really the land whispering, adapt or die. And in that struggle, humanity didn't just survive, it leaped forward, turning obstacles into stepping stones. Now picture a world where geography didn't just spark inventions, it ignited entire revolutions. Geography wasn't just about survival, it became the ultimate stage for propaganda, where empires turned landscapes into living advertisements of their power. Picture China's Grand Canal, stretching over 1,000 miles like a concrete dragon tamed by imperial will. Every barge of grain floating from the fertile south to the arid north wasn't just feeding capitals. It was proof that the emperor could bend rivers to his command. Workers dredging its silt weren't merely laborers, they were extras in a spectacle of control, performing the dynasty's mastery over nature itself. Now shift to Persia, where underground qanats didn't just deliver water, they whispered a message. By channeling mountain springs through tunnels to desert cities, kings demonstrated their ability to make the impossible flourish. Gardens bloomed in wastelands, their orchards and fountains screaming louder than any herald. This ruler commands even the rain. Meanwhile, Rome's roads radiated from the Forum like stone spokes, each mile marker carved with the emperor's name. Travelers didn't just see paths, they saw a web of dominance, every cobble shouting that no corner of the world lay beyond Caesar's grasp. But perhaps the most audacious propaganda came from the Andes, where Inca engineers strung grass bridges across dizzying chasms. These swaying walkways weren't just practical, they were theater. When subjects watched their king cross a rope span high above roaring rapids, it wasn't a journey, it was a dare. The message, if we can stitch mountains together, imagine what we'll do to rebels. Even Dutch windmills pumping seawater from reclaimed land spun tales of human triumph. Those turning sails weren't just machines, they were middle fingers to the ocean, declaring that no frontier was unconquerable. Yet this geographic branding had a dark edge. When the Khmer built Angkor Wat's vast moats, they didn't just store water. They mirrored the cosmic oceans of Hindu myth, positioning the king as a god walking among men. Versailles' artificial lakes and sculpted groves turned a swamp into a stage where Louis Roman XIV played the sun, his courtiers orbiting like planets. nature proved power absolute until droughts came or peasants starved while rulers posed. The land might applaud its conquerors, but history remembers who paid the price. Now, consider how borders themselves became billboards. Hadrian's Wall didn't just mark Rome's limit, its sheer scale screamed permanence to northern tribes. The Great Wall's watchtowers, visible for miles, were less about stopping Mongols than reminding them who owned the view. Even the Suez and Panama canals, though modern, followed the ancient script, their locks and channels declaring that continents could be rearranged for commerce. Geography wasn't just shaped by empires, it became their loudest herald, shouting across centuries that some lines were drawn to never fade. But the cleverest rulers knew landscapes could lie. Versailles' gardens required armies of gardeners to maintain their illusion of effortless order, just as Soviet collective farms hid famine behind posters of bumper harvests. Propaganda carved in stone or sown in fields outlasted paper decrees, but only until the earth itself rebelled. When Maya reservoirs dried up, their carved stelae boasting of eternal rain became jokes in the jungle. The land never lies forever, which brings us to the final twist. Today's satellites see all. Ancient kings could claim their canals tamed nature, but Google Earth shows the silt choking them. Their boundless empires shrink to pixels, yet the instinct remains. From Dubai's palm-shaped islands to China's artificial South China Sea bases, we still mold geography into headlines. The tools changed, but the game hasn't. Control the narrative written in dirt and water, and you don't just rule land, you shape how it's remembered. Even the most carefully crafted geographic propaganda carried seeds of destruction. The Aztecs' island capital, Tenochtitlan, was a marvel of engineering, floating gardens feeding thousands, causeways stretching to shore like spokes of a divine wheel. But that same watery isolation became their undoing. When Cortés arrived, the Spanish didn't just attack the city, they sabotaged its aqueducts, turning the Aztecs' sacred lake into a brackish trap. The very geography that proclaimed their gods' favor now magnified their downfall, as starvation and smallpox festered in the canals built to showcase imperial might. Egypt's pyramids faced a slower unraveling. For centuries, their alignment with Orion's belt proclaimed pharaohs as cosmic rulers. But when the Nile's floods grew erratic, whether from climate shifts or upstream deforestation, the grain that fed pyramid builders dwindled. Those perfect geometric slopes designed to touch the heavens couldn't compensate for empty granaries. The stones remained, but the faith they inspired crumbled with each failed harvest. Rome's roads tell the darkest irony. Built to speed legions and unify provinces, they became invasion highways when the empire weakened. Goths and Vandals followed those meticulously laid stones straight to the heart of Rome, turning symbols of control into vectors of collapse. The Appian Way, once lined with triumphant arches, now guided enemy armies. Even Hadrian's Wall, a brutal statement of Roman permanence, was abandoned so completely that locals later believed giants built it. Then there's the Khmer, whose sprawling temple complex at Angkor Wat mirrored the Hindu cosmos. Its moats represented celestial oceans, its towers the sacred Mount Meru. But their hydraulic empire relied on monsoon rains filling vast reservoirs. When droughts came, or when their intricate canals silted up from deforestation, the waterworks failed. The god's earthly home became a malaria-ridden ruin, its reflection pools cracked and dry. The lesson: geography could amplify an empire's voice, but nature always had the last word. Machu Picchu's cliffside terraces defied gravity, yet when Spanish horses couldn't climb those heights, the Inca's retreat became a prison. Venice's canals made it rich, but rising sea levels now threatened to drown its marble palaces. Every manipulation of landscape carried hidden costs, and when the bill came due, Even the mightiest civilizations found their propaganda turned against them. The land never forgets who tried to rewrite its rules. The Maya didn't just build cities, they built their own demise. For centuries, their temples rose skyward, their plazas bustling with traders and astronomers. But to fuel this grandeur, they stripped the land bare. Every limestone block for their pyramids required burning vast amounts of wood to create mortar. Farmland expanded, forests shrank, and without tree roots to anchor the soil, rains washed away fertile earth. Then came the droughts, decades of withering heat that turned reservoirs to cracked mud. The very ingenuity that carved civilization from jungle now left it defenseless. When crops failed and springs ran dry, the Maya didn't just abandon their cities, they unraveled 1,000 years of progress in a single brutal century. Their story isn't just one of collapse, it's a warning etched in stone. No empire outlasts the land that feeds it. Now sail across the Pacific to Easter Island, where isolation turned triumph into tragedy. The Rapa Nui didn't just carve moai, they moved them, hauling these towering statues miles across the island with ropes and log rollers. But with every tree cut for transport, the fragile ecosystem crumbled. No wood meant no canoes to fish beyond the reefs. Soil erosion starved crops. By the time Europeans arrived, the islanders were reduced to warfare over scraps, their once great society fractured by hunger. The lesson: even the most awe-inspiring monuments mean nothing if the land beneath them can't sustain life. Meanwhile, in the Sahara, the Garamontes thrived where no one thought possible. Their underground tunnels, called fagaras, tapped ancient aquifers, turning desert into wheat fields. For centuries, they ruled the sands, trading gold and slaves across the dunes. But water, unlike rock, doesn't last forever. As wells dried up, the fagaras clogged with sand, and the kingdom that mastered the desert became its latest victim. The Sahara didn't conquer them, it simply waited them out. Yet these stories aren't just ancient history. Look at modern Syria, where decades of over-farming and drought pushed rural communities into cities, fueling tensions that exploded into civil war. Or the Nile Delta, where rising seas and dwindling silt threaten Egypt's breadbasket. Even today's superpowers aren't immune. China's south-to-north water diversion project echoes the Garamontes tunnels, an audacious attempt to defy geography that could collapse under its own weight. And in the Amazon, deforestation follows the same deadly script the Maya wrote centuries ago. Borders still ignite conflicts, but now the battles are over rivers and aquifers. Ethiopia's Renaissance dam strains relations with Egypt, where 90% of the population relies on the Nile. India and China clash over Himalayan glaciers that feed 1 billion people. These aren't just political disputes, they're fights over the lifelines geography provides. The difference: today's empires wield bulldozers and satellites instead of spears and caravans. But the land still has the final say. Geography doesn't just draw lines on a map, it weaves the very fabric of cultures. Picture the Silk Road, where caravans didn't just carry silk and spices, they smuggled ideas in their saddlebags. Buddhist statues in Afghanistan bore Greek faces, a legacy of Alexander's long-vanished empire. Persian carpets showed up in Chinese tombs, while Roman glass dazzled the courts of Han Dynasty emperors. These weren't just trade goods, they were cultural Trojan horses, slipping across borders and reshaping civilizations. Now, zoom into the Mediterranean, where islands became melting pots by necessity. Crete absorbed Egyptian hieroglyphs and Mesopotamian math, blending them into the Minoan's labyrinthine palaces. Sicily turned Arab domes, Norman forts, and Greek temples into a single skyline, proving that geography could force even rivals to share a canvas. Meanwhile, the Swahili coast spoke in Arabic, traded in Indian rupees, and built homes from African coral, a linguistic and architectural smoothie stirred by monsoon winds. But cultural exchange wasn't always voluntary. The Himalayas didn't just divide India and Tibet. They funneled Buddhism through narrow passes like a sieve, straining out doctrines that couldn't survive the journey. What reached China was less a religion than a remixed Taoist. Philosophers recognized Buddha as a kindred spirit, while Tibetan monks incorporated local mountain deities into mandalas. Geography didn't just move culture, it edited it. Then there were the accidental exchanges. When the Black Death ravaged Eurasia, it hitched rides on Mongol supply trains and Genos merchant ships. The same routes that spread Venetian glass also delivered plague rats to unsuspecting ports. Even Columbus's discovery of America was a geographic flub. He'd been aiming for spices but stumbled into a cultural collision that reshaped global diets, languages, and genes. Yet some of history's most enduring fusions came from sheer inconvenience. The Sahara should have been a barrier, but Tuareg caravans turned it into a cultural conveyor belt. Timbuktu's libraries held Greek philosophy transcribed in Arabic, annotated by Jewish scholars, and bound in Moroccan leather. The desert didn't isolate, it curated, preserving knowledge where greener lands lost it to war or mildew. Today's world still dances to geography's tune. Hollywood movies dominate not because English is superior, but because America sits between two oceans and two film-loving continents. K-pop rockets across the globe because Korea's peninsular position made it a cultural pinball, bouncing between Chinese, Japanese, and Western influences until it forged something entirely new. The land doesn't just shape borders, it composes the soundtrack of our shared humanity. Rivers have always been more than water. They were liquid highways for ideas. Picture the Mediterranean, where Greek philosophers debated under Egyptian, trained architects while Phoenician merchants spread alphabets like gossip. This wasn't just trade, it was a cultural blender set to puree. Take Alexandria's lighthouse, a marvel built by Greek engineers using Egyptian labor, funded by Persian gold, and studied by Arab scholars centuries later. The sea didn't separate these cultures, it stirred them into something new. Now sail east to the Mekong Delta, where Indian merchants and Cambodian kings rewrote the rules of cultural fusion. Hindu temples sprouted in jungles, their carvings telling Ramayana epics with local twists. Monkeys from the myths now wore Khmer smiles. The river didn't just carry goods, it carried gods, with Buddhism and Hinduism floating downstream like leaves on the current. Meanwhile, in the highlands, animist spirits whispered through the gaps, creating a spirituality as layered as the delta's silt. But geography didn't just spread ideas, it filtered them. The Silk Road's mountain passes acted like a colander, straining Buddhism as it moved from India to China. By the time it reached Chang'an, meditation techniques had merged with Taoist breathing exercises, and Buddha's serene face wore the hint of a Confucian scholar's smile. Caravans didn't just transport cargo, they transformed it, with every mile adding new interpretations like layers of lacquer. Then there were the places geography kept secret. Ethiopia's highlands, isolated by deserts and rapids, preserved a version of Christianity untouched by European schisms. Their churches, carved into cliffs, held rituals unchanged since Byzantine traders first brought the faith. Isolation could be a cultural freezer, keeping traditions pristine while the world outside boiled with change. Yet even the mightiest empires learned they couldn't control this flow. When Persia's kings built the royal road, they imagined it would carry only their decrees. Instead, it became a sneak route for Greek art and Babylonian astronomy to infiltrate the capital. Roads, like rivers, have a way of ignoring borders. The same passes that let armies march also let ideas march back, turning conquests into conversations. Now consider the ultimate irony. Empires that tried to weaponize geography often became its victims. Rome's roads, designed to move legions, ended up carrying Christianity straight to the emperor's doorstep. China's Great Wall kept out Mongols but couldn't stop Buddhism from seeping through like water through cracks. Geography might set the stage, but culture always writes its own lines. Which brings us to the next act, when empires stopped adapting to the land and tried to bend it to their will. Canals didn't just change maps, they rewrote the rules of power. When the Suez Canal sliced through Egypt's isthmus in 1869, it didn't just connect the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, it hacked 12,000 miles off the journey from London to Bombay. Suddenly, Britain's empire could feed itself with Indian tea and Australian wool without sailing around Africa's treacherous cape. The canal was less a waterway than a cheat code, letting Europe bypass geography's oldest roadblocks. But the land fought back, silt clogged the channel, and nationalist uprisings turned it into a battleground. Control the ditch, and you controlled the world's wallet. Then came Panama, where the French dug their own grave, literally. Thousands of workers died in mosquito-infested jungles, their shovels battling mudslides and yellow fever. When the Americans took over, they didn't just build a canal, they invented a new landscape. Engineers dynamited mountains, dammed rivers, and even moved entire towns to create the Gatun Lake, a man-made reservoir that lifted ships over the continental divide. The result, a shortcut that made New York closer to San Francisco by sea than by train. Geography didn't just bend, it snapped, but the Dutch played the longest game. Faced with a country half underwater, they didn't just build dikes, they reinvented the coastline. Windmills pumped seas dry, turning marshes into pastures and pastures into cities. Amsterdam's canals weren't just pretty waterways, they were the veins of an empire, floating spices from Indonesia to European dining tables. The lesson: if the land won't cooperate, rebuild it. Rome took a similar approach. When marshes bred malaria near the capital, emperors didn't retreat, they rerouted rivers. Claudius drained the Fucine Lake with a tunnel so precise, its slope still baffles engineers. The land wasn't sacred, it was raw material, waiting to be carved into something useful. Yet for all their audacity, these projects carried hidden costs. The Suez Canal's saltwater influx killed freshwater species in the Nile Delta. Panama's locks introduced invasive fish that disrupted Caribbean ecosystems. Even the Dutch, masters of water, now face sinking cities as their drained peatlands compact like old sponges. The earth always balances the books. Now shift your gaze from engineering to mythology. The same landscapes humans reshaped with shovels and steel, our ancestors once explained with gods and monsters. The Greeks saw Poseidon's rage in rogue waves, while the Norse believed earthquakes were Loki writhing in his chains. Geography didn't just inspire legends, it became them. Take the Himalayas, where Hindu sages envisioned Mount Meru, a cosmic axis piercing the heavens. Or the Nile, whose floods were so reliable, Egyptians depicted them as the god Hapi's overflowing vase. Even volcanoes, from Hawaii's Peel to Japan's Fuji, were never just geological features. They were deities with tempers, their eruptions both punishment and gift. The most haunting tales emerged where land and sea clashed. The Japanese told of tsunami stones, markers placed by ancestors to warn future generations. Build no homes below this point. The Dutch had their own legend, the boy who plugged a leaking dike with his finger, a parable about vigilance against the sea's hunger. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were survival manuals encoding centuries of hard-won wisdom in myth. Now consider the irony. Today's satellites and concrete have replaced gods and giants as explanations for natural wonders, yet we still personify the land. We talk about rivers angry with floodwaters or forests reclaiming abandoned cities. Deep down, we still see geography as something alive, something with intentions. Maybe because despite all our canals and dams, the earth remains the ultimate storyteller. Its mountains and tides outlast every empire, waiting to inspire the next chapter. Mountains didn't just scrape the sky, they housed the divine. The Greeks placed their gods atop Olympus, where thunderbolts forged by Hephaestus echoed through valleys like divine artillery. To the east, the Hindu Kush cradled legends of Shangri-La, a hidden paradise where time stood still. Even the Nile, with its life-giving floods, guarded its origins like a jealous deity. Roman emperors sent expeditions to find its source, only to return with tales of swampy labyrinths and phantom lakes. These weren't just stories, they were humanity's way of explaining the unexplainable, turning rock and river into something sacred. Now, shift from myth to battlefield, where geography became a general's deadliest weapon. The Spartans didn't just choose Thermopylae for its narrow pass, they exploited every pebble. When Persian arrows blotted out the sun, the Greeks let the cliffs themselves block flanking attacks, turning 300 men into an unbreakable wall. Half a world away, the Mongols played a different game. Their horses galloped across steppes like wind over grass, but when they hit Hungary's marshes, those same steeds sank to their knees. The land didn't just favor one side, it dictated who could even fight. Then there was Napoleon, who marched into Russia expecting another quick victory, only to find the earth itself conspiring against him. Winter arrived early that year, transforming roads into icy graves. Supply wagons froze solid, and campfires couldn't thaw fingers turned black with frostbite. By the time his army staggered back across the Berezina River, the snow had claimed more lives than Russian cannons. Geography didn't just influence battles, it decided them long before the first shot was fired. But clever commanders turned terrain into theater. Hannibal didn't just cross the Alps, he staged the journey like a nightmare, sending elephants through blizzards to terrify Rome before his troops even arrived. The Viet Cong dug tunnels beneath jungles, their network so vast that American bombs fell harmlessly above, while below, an entire army moved like ghosts. Even in the digital age, altitude matters. Afghanistan's peaks have humbled empires from Britain to the Soviets, their drones and satellites useless against tribes who know every cave like the back of their hand. The lesson: rivers can be moats or highways, deserts can starve armies or hide them, forests can be graves or sanctuaries. Every conquest in history is really two battles, one against the enemy and one against the land itself. And while kings and generals fade, the mountains and rivers remain, waiting for the next player to learn their rules or ignore them at their peril. Geography didn't just shape battles, it sculpted the gods themselves. Picture the Nile, its annual floods so predictable they became the heartbeat of Egyptian religion. The river didn't just nourish crops, it birthed Osiris, god of resurrection, whose yearly rebirth mirrored the flood's life-giving surge. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, the Tigris and Euphrates erratic floods spawned a pantheon of capricious deities, gods, who demanded constant appeasement because the land itself refused to be tamed. These weren't just myths, they were survival manuals written in the language of the divine. Now, climb into the Andes, where thin air and jagged peaks forged a spirituality as steep as the terrain. The Inca didn't just worship the sun, they mapped their entire empire to its movements, building temples like Machu Picchu where sunlight pierced sacred windows only on solstices. Every mountain was an Apu, a living god who could withhold water or send avalanches. Contrast that with India's Ganges, where the river's ceaseless flow inspired the concept of reincarnation, a cycle as endless as the current carrying ashes to the sea. Islands took this even further. Easter Island's Maui faced inland, their stone eyes watching over villages because the ocean behind them was the realm of ancestors, not gods. Japan's Shinto spirits clung to waterfalls and ancient trees, turning geography into a sacred ledger where every rock had a story. Even deserts, seemingly barren, birthed monotheism. The stark emptiness of the Sinai sharpening Moses' revelation into a single, all-powerful voice. But the land didn't just inspire religions, it divided them. The Himalayas didn't merely separate India and Tibet, they split Buddhism into two branches. Theravada teachings flowed south like rivers into Sri Lanka's lush valleys, emphasizing personal enlightenment. Mahayana, trapped behind icy passes, evolved into a communal faith where bodhisattvas bridged the harsh landscape like spiritual guides. Geography didn't just host these beliefs, it rewrote their scriptures. Then there were the forced marriages of faith and terrain. When Christianity reached Norse fjords, the cross didn't replace Thor's hammer, it absorbed it. Stave churches carved pagan dragons into pews, and Yule became Christmas. In Mexico, Catholic saints inherited the temples of Aztec gods, their feast days timed to ancient harvest cycles. The land tolerated new gods but demanded they keep the old rhythms. Yet some landscapes resisted conversion entirely. Australia's outback defied missionary efforts because its Dreamtime stories were etched into the land itself. Every waterhole and sandstone cliff held ancestral memories no sermon could erase. Similarly, the Amazon's tribes saw the forest not as a creation but as a living parent, making European concepts of dominion over nature seem laughable. Today's pilgrims still follow geography's invisible hand. Hindus bathe in the Ganges' polluted waters because its divine essence transcends filth. Muslims face Mecca not just for unity, but because the desert's emptiness once erased all distractions between believer and God. And in Sedona, New Agers flock to red rock vortices, proving that even in our satellite-mapped world, we still seek the sacred in the shape of the land. The earth doesn't just hold our footprints, it holds our prayers, our fears, and our oldest stories. And sometimes, if you listen closely, it whispers back. The Ganges isn't just a river, it's a living goddess, her waters believed to wash away lifetimes of sin. Pilgrims flock to her banks, their prayers dissolving into the current like grains of sand. But this sacred flow didn't emerge from faith alone. The river's very geography carved its spiritual role. Unlike the unpredictable Tigris or the distant Nile, the Ganges descends from the Himalayas with glacial purity, her course stable enough to anchor rituals for millennia. Cities like Varanasi cling to her curves, their ghats staircased into the earth like altars, because here, geography and divinity share the same bed. Now trace the Jordan River's muddy path, where John the Baptist's hands once broke the surface to raise a savior from the water. This unassuming trickle, barely wider than a country road, became Christianity's liquid cradle because of where it flowed, through a desert where water meant survival. Every baptism here echoed an older truth. In arid lands, rivers don't just quench thirst, they promise rebirth. Even the Dead Sea's bitter salt, a stark contrast downstream, framed the Jordan's sweetness as a miracle. Then there's Mecca, a city that shouldn't exist. Nestled in a barren valley, its only lifeline was the Zamzam spring, a trickle that, according to tradition, gushed forth to save Hagar and Ishmael. That oasis didn't just sustain bodies, it magnetized souls. By Muhammad's time, Mecca's wells had made it a trading hub, but its deeper pull came from the Kaaba, a cube of stone anchoring the desert's spiritual chaos. Pilgrims circling it today follow footsteps worn into the earth by 1,300 years of devotion, all because geography placed water where none should be. Sacred landscapes share a pattern. They turn necessity into reverence. The Nile's floods birthed Osiris, god of resurrection, because crops rose annually from the silt like the dead returning. Japan's Mount Fuji became a Shinto deity not for its beauty, but because its eruptions taught respect for nature's fury. Even the Amazon's tribes see the rainforest as a parent, its vines and rivers threaded through creation myths. When survival depends on a mountain's snowmelt or a desert spring, gratitude hardens into worship, but climate change is rewriting these ancient contracts. The Ganges now shrinks as Himalayan glaciers retreat, her holy waters increasingly laced with industrial waste. Mecca's aquifers, drained by millions of pilgrims, now rely on desalination plants. And the Jordan, diminished by dams and droughts, may soon vanish altogether, taking with it baptism sites stood upon for centuries. The earth giveth, and now through our own hands it taketh away. Which brings us to the next chapter, where shifting rivers and rising seas aren't just altering faith, but redrawing the very lines on our maps. Rising seas didn't just reshape coastlines, they rewrote human history. 8,000 years ago, Doggerland stretched between Britain and Europe, a fertile plain where mammoths roamed and Mesolithic hunters thrived. Then the ice melted. Inch by inch, the North Sea swallowed forests and hills, turning a land bridge into legend beneath the waves. Today, fishermen still haul up ancient tools and bones in their nets, ghosts of a world geography erased. But this wasn't some prehistoric anomaly. The Sahara tells the opposite tale, a lush grassland that turned to dust. Cave paintings in Tassili Enaja show giraffes and crocodiles where now only dunes stretch, proving deserts were once gardens when the earth tilted differently on its axis. Now fast forward to our warming world. Venice's marble palaces already battle aqua alta floods, while Pacific islands like Tuvalu draft evacuation plans as saltwater poisons their freshwater lenses. But the real upheaval lies in the patterns we can't yet see. Imagine the Nile Delta, Egypt's breadbasket for 7,000 years, submerged under the Mediterranean, displacing millions northward. Or picture thawing Arctic permafrost unlocking new shipping routes, making Siberia the new Singapore while traditional ports drown. Geography never stopped moving, we just forgot how to watch its slow violence. The irony, some nations may gain what others lose. Greenland's melting ice reveals mineral-rich bedrock and suddenly valuable farmland, while Canada's Northwest Passage could dominate global trade. Meanwhile, drought-stricken regions might follow the Garamonte's ancient playbook, tapping fossil aquifers until those too run dry. The difference this time: 7 billion people are riding the pendulum, not scattered tribes. Our ancestors adapted to shifting borders by walking away, but where do you walk when the entire map is fluid? Yet history offers grimly creative solutions. The Dutch, masters of water defenses, already design floating neighborhoods and sea farming hybrids. Bangladesh experiments with salt-tolerant rice varieties, while Jakarta builds a giant seawall, a modern Great Wall against the ocean. But the most profound changes may be invisible. Think of cultural identities unraveling as ancestral homelands vanish underwater, or new conflicts over suddenly strategic mountain reservoirs. The next world map won't just show different borders, it'll tell stories of societies reshaped by the oldest power of all, the land itself, reminding us who's really in charge. For centuries, geography penned the rules of power, but now the earth itself is rewriting the script. Rising seas nibble at coastlines like a patient predator, swallowing island nations whole. Tuvalu's atolls, barely peaking above the Pacific, could vanish within decades, their culture preserved only in digital archives as saltwater claims ancestral graves. Meanwhile, Greenland's melting ice unveils an ironic twist. Buried beneath glaciers lie veins of rare minerals and suddenly arable land, turning a frozen wasteland into a geopolitical goldmine. The same forces drowning some shores are redrawing others, as thawing Arctic passages transform Siberia from frozen backwater to the world's next shipping superhighway. Yet the most audacious power grab isn't on Earth at all, it's in the asteroid belt. Companies already eye space rocks like Psyche, a metallic asteroid holding more nickel and iron than humanity has mined in its entire history. The Moon's polar ice, once just crater shadows, now represents rocket-fueled depots for interplanetary trade. Forget Silk Roads, imagine platinum highways, where robotic miners ferry cosmic riches back to orbital refineries. But here's the catch: without natural borders, who decides who owns the sky? The Outer Space Treaty of 1967 forbids national claims, but as technology outpaces diplomacy, the next empire might be built not on rivers or mountains, but Lagrange points and mineral rights. Back on Earth, climate refugees rewrite the rules of human movement. When Bangladesh's deltas submerge, where will millions flee? Not to walled fortresses, but to nations betting on newly fertile lands like Canada's thawing north. The same warming that drowns Miami could make Reykjavik the new Mediterranean, its once frigid ports bustling with climate migrants and cargo ships. Deserts might bloom with desalination tech, while traditional bread baskets wither, a brutal reminder that geography's lessons are never static. The takeaway: the land still holds the cards, but we're learning to play a wilder hand. Venice engineers floating neighborhoods, the Dutch design amphibious homes, and Singapore stacks farms in skyscrapers, proof that adaptation is the new conquest. Borders will shift, not just on maps but in our minds, as survival hinges less on controlling territory than mastering flexibility. The empires of tomorrow won't just fight over oil fields or shipping lanes. They'll battle rising tides, harvest asteroids, and turn scarcity into strategy. Because whether on Earth or among the stars, one truth remains: geography never stops teaching. We're just finally learning to listen. Geography wasn't just a stage for history. It was the unseen hand guiding every rise and fall, every triumph and collapse. Think about how the Nile didn't merely nourish Egypt. It dictated the rhythm of an entire civilization. Its floods so reliable they became the pulse of pharaonic power. Or consider the Himalayas, their icy peaks standing like silent sentinels, shielding India for centuries while shaping its spiritual and political isolation. These weren't passive landscapes, they were active players in the human story, whispering constraints and opportunities to those who knew how to listen. Now fast forward to today. The same forces that toppled empires still pull the strings of global power. Rising seas aren't just erasing coastlines, they're redrawing the chessboard of geopolitics. Tiny atolls vanishing beneath the waves could trigger mass migrations, while thawing Arctic ice unlocks shipping routes that might shift trade empires northward. Even space, the final frontier, follows geography's old rules. Asteroids rich in rare metals could become the next contested territories, with Lagrange points as strategic as mountain passes once were. The game hasn't changed, only the scale, but here's the twist: we're no longer just subjects of the land, we're collaborators. The Dutch didn't surrender to the sea, they redesigned it, turning floods into farmland with dikes and windmills. Singapore, with no natural resources, stacked farms into skyscrapers, proving scarcity can spark invention. And as climate refugees reshape demographics, The nations that thrive will be those treating geography not as fate, but as a puzzle to solve. The lesson, adaptation, is the new conquest. So the next time you unfold a map, don't just see borders, see conversations. The jagged lines of a coastline, the curl of a river, the stark divide of a desert. Each tells a story of empires built and lost, of cultures clashing and merging. Those lines aren't static, they're alive, shifting with every storm, every drought, every human innovation. Geography doesn't just belong to the past, it's scripting our future. And if history's taught us anything, it's that the land always has the last word. If you've enjoyed unraveling these hidden threads of history, hit subscribe for more deep dives into the forces that shape our world. Because the map's secrets, they're still being written.